Greetings and welcome to Writers on Writing. I am your host, Dr. Brenda Greene. This radio broadcast is paid for by Medgar Evers College, and I am the Executive Director and founder of the Center for Black Literature and Director of the National Black Writers Conference. And Writers on Writing comes to you each Sunday and gives you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers from the African diaspora talk about their work, their lives, and their craft. And I am very, very pleased to have with me today an award-winning author who's written across the genres, Jewell Parker Rhodes. Welcome, Jewell.
Oh, thank you so very much. It's wonderful to see you, Brenda, and make the reconnection. And thank you for all the work that you do for our community, for the world.
Well, you're very welcome. It's good to see you again. I saw you many, many years ago when we were doing the National Black Writers Conferences at Medgar Evers College, and we've continued that work. And it's really, really exciting to be honoring you for a genre that you really don't normally think about. You know, initially when you started writing that, we were not using that term speculative fiction, but
Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
When I started my first novel, Voodoo Dreams, I was just trying to tell the story of how was it that the African diaspora's faith and its practice of faith became so demonized within America. And then, of course, you get into the miracles, the spirituality, and that just opened up a whole world of the African diaspora spiritual tradition. And it just became part of everything that I wrote afterwards. But I didn't plan it. It just sort of like, I think, happened as a natural evolution from my searching for myself, more about my culture and our Western narrative, and certainly more about, in particular, my ancestors or that other spiritual essence that guides me.
Okay, well, we're going to get more into that, but I first like to share with our listening audience some background information about you. So, Dr. Jewell Parker Rhodes is the author of 6 adult novels: Voodoo Dreams, Magic City, Douglas's Women, Season, Moon, and Hurricane, as well as the memoir Porch Stories: A Grandmother's Guide to Happiness, and 2 writing guides, Free Within Ourselves, Fiction Lessons for Black Authors, and the African American Guide to Writing and Publishing Nonfiction. And you are also the author of, more recently, children's books, which we'll talk about, which include Ghost Boys, Bayou Marie, and some others. And Dr. Rhodes is the founding artistic director of the Virginia G. Piper Center for Creative Writing and Narrative Studies, was and is an endowed chair at Arizona State University. But you right now, excuse me, right now you are living in Seattle, Washington. So why don't you share with our audience how you came to become a novelist, a YA author, a children's author, and the fact that your fiction, as you were describing, covers really both genres and also is intergenerational.
Oh, thank you very, very much. I think I do think I was born to be an author. That I have a short story that I wrote in the 3rd grade, and I illustrated it too. And my teacher had me go to the different classes and read my story. It was called The Last Scream, and it ended with a scream. And I got so excited. But even though I wrote stories, I wrote poetry, really bad poetry, and I read all the time. Nobody ever said, "Oh, you can be a writer." You know, my grandpa worked in the steel mills. My mom stayed, well, not my mom, my grandma, who's like my mom, stayed at home taking care of kids, and nobody had gone to college. And so, artist, writer, but most significantly, all the books that I was ever given to read were about white characters by white
Yes.
authors.
I can
So
relate to that.
yes, and today, young people, I tell them you're so lucky because you have representation. But I didn't know Black people wrote books. I really honestly didn't. So I watched TV and I used to like the 4 o'clock movies. My grandmother would be ironing and I'd watch the movies and I was terrible at sports. So I decided I was going to be an actress and a dancer. Lucky because Carnegie Mellon University, which is a wonderful world-class program, I auditioned for it and got in as a drama student. And when I was a junior, I was going into the library, and usually the drama students, we didn't need to go to the library. We just had our scripts, right? And I
Right.
go to the library and I see this book, Gail Jones' Corregidora. And I read it and it was like a revelation. Black people write books. Black women write books.
And college. This didn't
Yes.
happen until
Oh, yes,
college.
yes, in college. And literally, I transferred my major the very next day. And then I lived through all those years of being in creative writing classes where all the students will say, well, why didn't you tell me your characters are Black? And then, of course, I would say, well, why don't you tell me your characters are white? And I discovered I had learned to read white. And so, what I was in search of, because I think my grandma was a hoodoo lady and she had taught me some wonderful traditions and values. And I was in search of what I needed to do in order to be Jewell Parker Rhodes, to be a proud Black woman. And I stumbled upon the Time Life cookbook of Creole and Acadian cooking. And it talked about Marie Laveau as being the most famous, most influential Black woman in New Orleans during the time of slavery, when
Yes.
most Black women were either enslaved or free colored or mistresses, but a very tiny portion of free colored, as they called them then. And I wondered, well, how is it that she got to be so powerful? Who is she? And then I started hearing songs, Marie Laveau. Seriously, I can't sing. And then I found out that Eartha Kitt wanted to play the character Marie Laveau. And I went to go see Eartha Kitt, and we were talking, and she started telling me about spells that she had learned to call back the dead. And they were like spells my grandmother had told me about how to call on the ancestors to come and visit you. And it took me 7.5 years in writing that novel. But in writing that novel, the whole explosion of what is the African diaspora tradition, how the faith was substantial and just as
Mhm.
significant as any other religion. And that this Black woman, you can find in the Daily Picayune, the newspaper of the day, an article about how she walked on water on Lake Pontchartrain. Now, we all know that everything you read in the newspaper is true, right? But I got to write that scene of a Black woman, communing with her ancestors and walking on water. So until I started writing about Marie Laveau, no one had written about her in a respectful, spiritual way. They had seen her as a con artist. And I think
Yes.
she was a con in a sense that if she could make people leave her alone so she could be free to do what she needed to do, then she would use spectacle. But that wasn't her faith and it wasn't her talent.
And that's the way that Black people over the centuries have survived, by using the elements of magic, or the perception of power. I think about the people could fly, and the
Yes.
story. Yes. And then the stories that were told on, the messages that were given in the drums and the music and the songs. All of
Oh,
that is part of what people have been doing for centuries, and represents such a rich tradition of the celebration and validation of culture and beliefs.
absolutely. See, and I, as a young woman, didn't know any of that. And I discovered it, and so I've got the voodoo ceremonies and the drums and all the various wonders. But also, when you say magic, and I think of magic sometimes as being um, fabricated. So that I do draw in the novel the distinction between when Marie Laveau was making things up to sort of like tantalize and get right people to leave her alone,
Mm-hmm.
versus all the other things that she did that were so real and so authentic. So it's just like McKay's, I wear the mask. And so what Western tradition took is the mask, and then turned
Yes.
that to the stereotype of, Black spirituality, and I learned that it's so much more. And it was a wonderful odyssey. And I remember feeling, now I'm whole, that I had become um, me in a new way, and all the history and narrative, and that had been not given to me. And so it made sense for me for my second book. I'm reading the newspaper, Magic City, and I'm reading about the Tulsa Race Massacre, that though they didn't call it the massacre then. So I was the first person to write a novel about the Tulsa Race Massacre, and it came out entitled Magic City, and there was some magic and spirituality in that book, and I loved it. And they reissued it for the 100th anniversary of
Wonderful.
Race Massacre, so you can find a new edition now. But when I was writing Voodoo Dreams, even then within the Black community, there wasn't a lot of acceptance of voodoo, because of the way that we had been mistaught, some of us, about our heritage. And then when I wrote Magic City, I had the KKK coming after me, or people saying, this is a lie. I saw the KKK in Oklahoma, that this never happened. These bodies are not buried. So I had two novels of Black history that in some way or another, I had to sort of like, I was going against a grain. So I was educating myself, as well as asserting a new kind of narrative.
Yes, that is something that, as you were talking, I kept thinking about what we studied when we first began to look at the traditions in Africa, and the work that was done on the Africanisms that are present in our literature, in our music, and in our dance. You were bringing that to life. You also
Yeah.
continue with Season and Moon.
Yes, they had always wanted me to write a sequel to Voodoo Dreams. And people who read Voodoo Dreams, they either don't go to work the next day and stay in bed all day and read it, or, they just love the book, and don't play tardy on work. And I always worried about doing a sequel, because it would be compared poorly to the original.
Yes.
But Voodoo Season Moon Hurricane ended up being about a descendant in contemporary New Orleans. She's a medical doctor who learns she's the heir to Marie Laveau. And as I was writing that, we had other traditions, such as bringing in jazz as a new spiritual tradition to replace a lot of the voodoo ceremonies. And that happened down in Congo Square in New Orleans. And there's a lot of work on the power of jazz as being a secular spirituality. And then I learned about, from Oscar Michaud, I had seen a glimpse of Black vampires, and in colonized Africa, they would have these stories of white bureaucrats who would gather up Black people, take them into a basement, and then later on you would see them carrying buckets of blood. So they actually called it the Wazimamoto, a Black vampire. And that legend of the Black vampire came into the second book, Moon. And by the time Moon was done, the Hurricane Katrina had happened, and Charity Hospital was, devastated. And so literally then I have this Black doctor spiritualist going back to New Orleans to help her city, and to help the people who needed her care, and also expanding that sense of community power of African, community, that we are the village, and her saying, I have discovered who I am, and now my job is to be in service to my village, the people surviving Hurricane Katrina.
Right. So we're going to talk a little bit, because you did a story that was based on that. But I want to go back to the statement you made about the jazz being part of the tradition, because when you think about Afrofuturism now, so they are combining the literature and the culture and the jazz and the poetry and the art. All of that is intersecting to create, and technology, to create what we call Afrofuturism. You know, so
Oh, how
your
beautiful.
book also is really representative of Afrofuturism, as well as the broader spectrum of the broader umbrella of speculative fiction.
Clearly, you as the renowned scholar in the Center for Black Literature knew more about what I was doing than I did.
Well, we
But
all have to do we all have to do our research, right? And doing this this conference, I was really inspired by Octavia Butler. You know, we did it one
well,
year,
of
a
course,
symposium, and you're getting the Octavia Butler Award. But we did a symposium on Octavia Butler and what she did as a Black woman who centered the female experience and just, you know, gave these cautionary tales, but also critical interpretations about what was going on in our environment, and also respecting history, you know, bringing together the history and the importance of saving our planet and our environment, and looking at what happens if when disaster strikes,
yes.
as
You
in Hurricane Katrina.
Yes, yes. And, actually, I've taught Octavia Butler's work many, many a time. And I think it's a difference that when you're the writer doing the work, I call the work I do dramatic fiction writing, because literally I can't write until the voice comes to me. So if you said, like right now, can you tell us, the first line, the first page of each of your novels? I could recite it to you,
Oh,
um, I mean, it's like that literally I have to internalize the voice, and then it's the drama of finding out which choice do my characters make. So I don't plot, I don't outline. It's all totally an emotional experience. But I was writing that way, but then in the classroom, I was, of course, critiquing other people in the ways of understanding what they were doing. So learning from Morrison and Walker and Gail Jones and Octavia Butler, but I never apply that sort of critical lens to my own work, which is why I'm so excited and want to hear the papers coming up, because it's like, oh, that's what I was doing.
well, yeah, that's really interesting. You know, the world, moving between that world of the scholar and the writer, is interesting, and you really cannot think about what other people are saying if you really want to get at the essence of the story that you want to tell.
Yes,
So
yes.
talk a little bit more about that. You started about your writing process, and then you also have some tips for writers, for people who are writing fiction.
Oh, yes. Well, actually, it turns out I'm essentially, I think, an historical fiction writer.
Yes,
And
Douglas's Women.
yes, 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 which that was a trip. That book nearly killed me. But and I didn't know I liked history. But as it's from Voodoo Dreams on, I'm always searching for parts of my ancestral heritage, to try to put together the pieces of me. Actually, this year, I hired a firm to actually do my ancestry and my whole
Okay.
DNA analysis to find out who I'm me. And I'm not exactly who I thought I was, but I went in search of me in terms of getting all these bits and pieces of information. But I lost my train of thought. What were we saying,
No,
Brenda?
you're talking. Well, I because I asked you about Douglas's Women. I got excited,
Yeah,
but I
yeah.
asked you about your writing process and the fact that you have these tips for writers.
Okay, so the writing process is generally I try to write most days. If I don't write every day, I don't kill myself. I learned very early on that you can set up a negative feedback loop if you push yourself into writing when the time isn't right, and so I always sit down and I have a soundtrack for everything that I write. Okay, so
Oh, okay. The
yeah, I
music. Okay, okay. You're
when I was
bringing that
writing
music.
Ghost Boys, Kendrick Lamar's Damn played all the time. And actually, my poor husband, because it's like 3 years I heard that same album because I put it on over and over. And I'd say I'll write until, I get through the album. And then sometimes it just goes on and on and on. But I have to go back and reread what I wrote get into character, and then continue writing. But to write, I think the real tips is one, to be kind to yourself. Don't set up any negative feedback loops. And if it's not working that day, then get up and take a walk. So you try. The consistency is trying, but it's not that every day the spirits are going to come. You have to wait for the spirit to come. And then, of course, once the draft is done, then you got to get in there and do the fine tooth editing of writing it. So that's a completely different skill set. If you're writing historical fiction, don't think that history is all of it. So it's not about writing a book, say like James Michener, that was just packed with historical information. Instead, it's still a story of reimagining the truth. So it's not telling the exact truth, but reimagining it. And I reimagine in my historical fiction by thinking, what would it have felt like, for the wife of Frederick Douglass to decide, I'm not going to learn how to read, to know that her husband had a white mistress? What did it feel like to have been a free woman, and yet she was in some ways dismissed by this former,
Yes.
ex-slave man, and so I always go after the emotional truth. And also, when you're writing, you are still the artist. What you want to say to the world, what you want to give to your readers, that's your primary momentum. So you're not there to tell accuracy. So again, it's the emotional truth, and to make it feel so human and real and so well characterized that people just totally buy it and feel as though they've learned a little bit about these historical figures and ways that connect them to our current humanity. That if we say, even with Douglass, that he was so special and so perfect, then we're doing him an injustice. He was a man, and man and woman. We are a mixture of so many things. So there's nothing wrong to talk about the blessings of our vulnerabilities and our strengths, or the things that we've done right or run wrong. Our children need that we need to find the heroic in the ordinary folks. So my grandmother was heroic, and so just because your name might be a famous name doesn't mean I should put you on a pedestal and deny you just your common humanity. So that's another guideline of my work. So writing, the other thing I would say is don't let yourself be rushed. And that's kind of hard to say, because I've been a professor my whole life. So if I wanted to take 7 years on a novel or 3 years on a novel, I could. But people pay novelists so little, even in the film industry, even in whatever it is. It seems like the writer is paid the least. And so sometimes you fall into the pattern of, I got to rush. And I was even told you need to write a novel a year. And I just ignored it. Because one of the things that you have to think about is that everything that we write, it's like our Harlem Renaissance. It's going to leave a legacy, or you want it to leave a legacy. So if you get rushed and hurried, who gets the bad reviews? You do.
That's right.
Who doesn't end up being a legacy, you're the one who suffers. So I have never put out a book that I didn't want to put out, that I didn't, when I put it out at the time, feel that it was the very best that I could do. Now, if I went back, I could write all of them different, because I've grown.
That's what happens. Yes.
That sense of hurry. And the other thing is that it still goes on. I have letters from editors who said, oh, well, we can't buy this book because we can't figure out who's going to read it. Black people don't read books. I have those letters in my files. Now the discrimination can be much more subtle, that maybe not so subtle, okay? That it's sort of like, say, for example, one person in publishing asked me about, for Ghost Boys, that the ghosts were kind of creepy. And at the end, they combined Day of the Dead with the African-American spirituality, which, there were millions of slaves in Mexico. And so they would have come together because their religions were very, very similar. And so I was told that was creepy, but not creepy as in, horror that's speculative and wonderful because it's making a point about culture, but it's creepy as in, ew, don't you want to leave that out? Also, when I write now, particularly for young people, I know how to write standard English. I know how to write complete sentences. But one of the things that Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and so many others taught me is that there is a different way of telling a story, a different timeline, a different
Yes.
centering of what's important, a different rhythmic tone, that's important. And so most of our young people today are reading standard English with diverse characters. And that's my point of view. I'm making a generalization. So I don't mean
Mhm.
it. I'm making a generalization because I get dramatic and make a point. Okay. Not everybody does that. But I purposely write according to rhythm, how I hear the voice. So for every novel, adult or young, I'm thinking of my grandmother telling me stories on the porch stories. So that's why you'll have a fragment or phrase. And so I get lots and lots of copy editors who go in and want to correct it and standardize it. And I've just maybe in the last 10 years in my career gotten to the point where my publishers and editors will tell the copy editor, a light touch, leave it alone.
It's
Because,
amazing that they're still doing that,
oh, yes,
because, you should recognize the importance of voice. One of the reasons, as you said, people like Toni Morrison were celebrated is because they knew how to capture the rhythm and the voice. And you talked about emotional truth, which I think is really such a good message, and the importance of voice. We are running out of time, but what I'd like you to, as we come to a close, you've shifted over to more young children's literature. Tell us about your projects that you're currently, the book that you most recently did,
and
and goes, which ended up on the banned books list, right?
oh,
Or,
well,
well,
that was Ghost Boys. Ghost
Ghost
Boys
Boys and the
ran
other,
for
yes.
three years about police brutality because I was born when Emmett Till, I was like 2 years old when Emmett Till was murdered. And that always haunted me. And I wanted to answer the question, why are Black boys still being murdered? And now I'm a grandmother, for heaven's sakes, okay? And then when I was studying that, I learned about the school to prison pipeline. So Black Brother is really about the colorism in the school to prison pipeline. And so those two are like companion books. And then I went into Paradise on Fire about wildfires, of how do you get kids who live in urban deserts, who don't have nature, who don't learn how to swim as I did, to care about climate change if you don't live amidst, the wonder of nature. So that's Paradise on Fire. But my new book coming out in October is called Treasure Island Runaway Gold. It is a remake, a contemporary story of the Treasure Island story by Robert Louis Stevenson. And that story was famous because it was one of the few times where the adult betrayed the child. That was a big deal. So that happens, but it happens in contemporary New York. They don't sail ships, they skateboard, and they skateboard in under
I love it.
tunnels. And the mystery, the treasure is connected to witnessing the history of the African American burial ground, which is right there in New York, where there were 5 acres of a cemetery of Black bones in which the city of New York built over them. And so the
Yes.
whole idea that Wall Street was a place where they had the wall where Blacks were sold, I merged African American history with, this sort of, pirate treasure, and a group of Asian, African American girl, an African American boy, and a white boy searching for that agency to be empowered. And they find a gold of spirit and ancestry that's much more important than any money.
Wow, that's what's wonderful. I can't wait to read that. Sounds like a film also.
Actually, I was hired by a film company to do it for her.
Okay, all right.
They are working on a film. Oh, and for all your young people out there, they have a little dog, a rat terrier, who does have his showdown with the rats down in the subways, and they call him Hip Hop. So he's a sweetie. But just one last quick thing, we can fit it in. When I started writing, I wanted to write for children. So I wrote for adults, trying to become good enough to write for the more challenging audience of youth. And that got more reaffirmed to me in that my 2 children, who are now in their early 30s, they both went through school, and I read no books by Black people. They both read the same one, Roll of Thunder, Hear My
Oh,
Cry.
yes, Mildred
Yeah.
Taylor. Yes.
And you love that book, but I set out as my goal that I wanted my books to be in a classroom and to be in parents and teachers' hands so that no kid would ever go through school and not see themselves in a book, as well as not see themselves in a book, period. So I write for teachers, librarians, families, my people, the whole world, everybody. But until our books get into the schools and you have the language of Black narrative, you have the timing of Black narrative, the rhythm of Black narrative, those kids are going to grow up and have to wait till they go to college to learn what is African American literature. So I'm trying to give it to them at least by the third grade.
Thank you so much for that message. Thank you for the work that you're doing for all of us, and for really dramatizing and telling our stories in authentic and creative and imaginative ways.
Okay. And thank you. I'll see you at the end of the month in New York, New York.
Okay. And yes, and I want you to visit the website for Jewell Parker Rhodes. Remember, the writer is always reading, the reader is always writing. Keep reading and writing. Support her, get her books. And this radio show is paid for by Medgar Evers College. Write me at writers@mec.cuny.edu. And thank you so much, Jewell. I really have enjoyed this conversation.